Picture this. It's August 1945, and somewhere in the dense jungles of the Pacific, a group of young Japanese women clutch medical bags with trembling hands. They've just made a decision that goes against everything they were taught, everything they believed about honor, duty, and death before dishonor. These nurses are about to surrender to the enemy. But here's what makes this story extraordinary. They expected torture, humiliation, perhaps even execution. What they received instead would shatter everything they thought they knew about their captors and themselves. The morning mist still clings to the bomb-scarred trees as smoke rises from what was once a Japanese field hospital. The thunder of artillery has finally stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that feels almost more terrifying than the chaos of battle. From hidden bunkers and makeshift shelters, figures begin to emerge, shadows of women in torn white uniforms, their medical bags now more precious than gold. 23-year-old nurse Kimiko Tanaka would later write in her diary, "We expected to die that morning. We had prepared our hearts for death." She wasn't alone in that expectation. Every one of these women had been conditioned to believe that capture meant something worse than death itself. They fashion white flags from torn bedsheets and bandages, ironic symbols considering these same hands had spent months patching up wounded soldiers, racing against time and enemy fire. Now they wave these flags not in medical urgency, but in the universal language of surrender. The jungle around them tells the story of Japan's final defeat. Palm trees stand like broken monuments, their fronds shredded by shrapnel. Medical supplies lie scattered, morphine vials glinting in the dappled sunlight, surgical instruments abandoned in the mud. This is the end of everything they had fought for, everything they had believed in. As American voices grow closer, the nurses huddle together. Some whisper prayers to ancestors. Others simply stare into the green darkness, waiting for their fate to unfold. They've heard the stories, propaganda tales of American brutality, of enemies who showed no mercy to the defeated. But what awaited them in that jungle clearing would challenge every assumption, every piece of wartime propaganda they had ever been fed. In the coming hours, these women would discover something that their own government had tried desperately to hide from them. Sometimes, even in the darkest moments of war, humanity can triumph over hate. The question that haunts this story isn't what they expected to happen. It's what actually did. To understand the shock of what came next, we must first step into the world these women came from, a world where surrender was not just forbidden, it was unthinkable. Rewind to 1943. In training hospitals across wartime Japan, young women line up in pristine white uniforms, their faces set with determination that masks an inner turmoil. These aren't just nursing students, they're being molded into instruments of imperial will, their natural compassion weaponized for the emperor's cause. A nurse must be prepared to die for her patients, for her emperor, for her nation. The instructors drone, their voices echoing in sterile halls. Capture is a betrayal of everything sacred. The words bore into impressionable minds like bullets, creating wounds that would take years to heal. Kimiko Tanaka, who we met in that jungle clearing, had once been one of those eager students. Her letters home from nursing school reveal a gradual transformation, from a girl who dreamed of healing people to a young woman convinced that death was preferable to dishonor. "Mother," she wrote in 1944, "I pray I will have the courage to choose death if the Americans come. I could not bear to shame our family." But here's what the military trainers never told them. Compassion has a way of fighting back against indoctrination. Even as these women learned to see themselves as expendable tools of war, their daily work treating wounded soldiers created an internal conflict that grew stronger with each life they saved. The archives reveal a troubling pattern. Young nurses were systematically fed propaganda about American forces, stories of mass executions, torture, sexual violence. These weren't just scare tactics. They were psychological weapons designed to ensure that Japanese personnel would fight to the death rather than surrender. Fear, it turns out, was the Empire's most effective tool for maintaining loyalty. Consider the diary of Nurse Akiko Sato, discovered decades later in her family's possessions. Today I treated a boy, barely 18, who whispered that he wanted to see his mother again. I told him that was weak thinking, but my heart broke saying it. Are we healing them only to send them back to die? The contradiction was eating them alive. Their hands saved lives while their minds were programmed for sacrifice. Their hearts felt compassion while their training demanded cold obedience. They were caught in a web of conflicting loyalties, to their patients, to their families, to an emperor they had never seen but were expected to die for. As 1945 wore on and Japan's situation became increasingly desperate, many of these nurses found themselves stationed in the Pacific Islands, the Empire's last line of defense. They bandaged wounds that wouldn't heal, administered morphine they couldn't spare, and watched young men die for a cause that seemed increasingly hopeless. Yet even in those final months, the propaganda machine never stopped grinding. Radio broadcasts reminded them daily that Americans were monsters, that surrender meant torture and shame. The women carried these messages in their minds like poison, never suspecting that their greatest shock wouldn't come from their enemy's cruelty, but from their unexpected mercy. The moment of capture arrives with startling quietness. American soldiers emerge from the tree line like ghosts materializing. The nurses freeze, their white flags fluttering in hands that shake with terror. This is it, the moment they've been dreading, the encounter they've been told would strip away their humanity and dignity. But something's wrong. The soldiers aren't snarling. They're not raising weapons or barking orders. Instead, they approach with a caution that seems almost respectful. Jesus Christ, they're just kids, mutters Sergeant Tommy Rodriguez from Brooklyn, his rifle lowered. At 24, he's older than most of the nurses trembling before him. His own sister is studying nursing back home, and for a moment the Pacific War feels impossibly small. The silence stretches. The nurses wait for commands, for violence, for the brutality they've been promised. Instead, they hear something unexpected. Concern in foreign voices. "Anyone hurt?" asks a medic in broken Japanese, learned from a phrase book. Water? Nurse Tanaka would later describe this moment as the first crack in everything we believed. The Americans don't separate them or bind their hands. They don't search them roughly or strip away their dignity. Instead, they gesture toward a makeshift camp visible through the trees, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they understand that sudden motions might trigger panic. The walk to the temporary holding area feels like a march through an alternate reality. Where are the jeering soldiers, the instruments of torture, the evidence of the barbarism they've been warned about? Instead, they see American troops sharing cigarettes, reading letters from home, treating wounded Japanese prisoners with the same care they'd show their own men. One nurse stumbles on the jungle path, exhaustion finally overwhelming adrenaline. She closes her eyes, expecting a boot to her ribs or worse. Instead, a gentle hand helps her up. "Easy there, ma'am," says a voice with a southern drawl. The nurse stares into the face of a young American soldier, barely older than her brother back home, and sees not a monster, but a tired young man who looks like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. The holding area defies every expectation. Canvas tents provide shade. Clean water sits in metal containers. There are no bars, no chains, no instruments of interrogation visible anywhere. The nurses huddle together, whispering questions they can't answer. When will the torture begin? Why are they giving us water? Is this some kind of trick? As the sun sets on their first day in American custody, the nurses lie on real cots with clean blankets, staring at canvas ceilings and wrestling with a truth their minds can barely process. Their captors have shown them more kindness in 6 hours than some of their own officers had shown in months. The real interrogation, they're beginning to realize, won't come from their captors. It will come from within themselves, as everything they thought they knew about the enemy begins to crumble. Day 2 brings revelations that shake the nurses to their core. Morning arrives with the smell of coffee and bacon, real food, not the rice gruel and pickled vegetables they've survived on for months. A young American corporal approaches their tent with a tray of hot food, and the nurses recoil as if he's carrying poison. This must be the trick. This must be when the cruelty begins. "Breakfast," he says simply, setting down the tray and walking away. No demands, no questions, just food, offered to enemy prisoners with the same casualness he might show to friends back home. Nurse Sato stares at the bacon, her stomach cramping with hunger. "It could be poisoned," whispers another nurse. But the smell is intoxicating, and slowly, carefully, she takes a bite. Then another. The food is not only safe, it's better than anything she's eaten in a year. This pattern repeats throughout the day. Small acts of humanity that don't fit any narrative they've been taught. When Nurse Yamada develops a fever, an American medic, someone they've been told would kill wounded Japanese without a second thought, brings aspirin and cool water. He checks her temperature with the same gentle professionalism she's seen in the best doctors. "Why?" she asks him in broken English, the word barely a whisper. The medic, a soft-spoken man from Ohio named Bill Crawford, just shrugs. "You're sick. That's what we do for sick people." The simplicity of that answer hits harder than any propaganda speech. These Americans aren't treating them as enemies to be destroyed or trophies to be displayed. They're treating them as human beings who happen to be on the wrong side of a war. By afternoon, the impossible becomes routine. Clean blankets appear without being requested. Medical supplies are freely shared. When one nurse's uniform tears, she's given thread to mend it, thread that could have been used for American soldiers' gear. The gesture feels almost sacred in its simplicity. Perhaps most unsettling is the Americans' curious respect for their dignity. Male soldiers don't leer or make crude comments. Guards avert their eyes when the nurses need privacy. The camp's commander, a weathered colonel from Texas, posts explicit orders that the Japanese nurses are to be treated with the same courtesy afforded to any medical personnel. "These women saved lives," he tells his men. "That makes them deserving of respect, regardless of which flag they served under." The nurses overhear this conversation, and it opens wounds they didn't know existed. When did their own officers last speak of them with such dignity? When did their own commanders worry about their comfort or safety? Evening brings the most shocking revelation yet. The Americans have been in radio contact with the Red Cross, arranging for the nurses' eventual repatriation to Japan. Not as prisoners to be traded, not as propaganda tools to be exploited, but as non-combatants whose primary crime was being on the losing side of history. As darkness falls, Nurse Tanaka writes in her diary, "Today I learned that monsters can be kind, and that everything I was taught about honor might have been wrong. I don't know which terrifies me more, the thought of staying here or the thought of going home. The third week of captivity becomes a masterclass in the power of lies and the pain of truth." Nurse Tanaka discovers a discarded American magazine, its pages featuring advertisements for Coca-Cola and photographs of American families at picnics. The faces in these images don't match the demonic caricatures from Japanese propaganda posters. These Americans have children who laugh, mothers who worry, fathers who work ordinary jobs. They look remarkably, disturbingly human. "Look at this," she whispers to her fellow prisoners, pointing to a photograph of an American nurse treating wounded soldiers in a field hospital. The scene could have been lifted from their own experiences, except the faces are different colors, the uniforms a different shade. They have nurses too, just like us. The realization hits like a physical blow. For 2 years, Japanese media had portrayed Americans as savage beasts, incapable of civilization or compassion. Yet here's evidence of hospitals, schools, families, a complex society not so different from their own. The cognitive dissonance creates a psychological earthquake that shakes every foundation of their beliefs. The irony becomes almost unbearable when they overhear American soldiers talking about their own propaganda fears. "I thought all Japanese were fanatics who'd never surrender," admits Private Johnson from Minnesota. "Turns out they're scared kids, just like us." The American propaganda machine, it seems, had painted the Japanese with the same broad brush of dehumanization. But here's where the story takes its most heartbreaking turn. As the nurses begin to see through the lies they've been fed, they start to question everything else they've been told. If Americans aren't monsters, what else was false? If surrender doesn't mean torture and death, how many of their comrades died needlessly rather than seeking help? Nurse Yama Da finds herself counting backwards through the war, imagining all the moments when surrender might have saved lives instead of ending them. The young pilot who chose to crash his plane rather than land safely, the wounded soldiers who refused medical aid from captured American supplies, the civilians who chose mass suicide over occupation. How many died because of lies? She asks her diary, her handwriting shaky with emotion. How many chose death because they believed what we believed? The guilt becomes consuming. These women, trained to save lives, must now confront the possibility that their beliefs contributed to needless deaths. Every act of kindness from their captors feels simultaneously like a gift and an accusation. The Americans, perhaps sensing this psychological turmoil, handle it with unexpected sensitivity. They don't gloat about their moral superiority or lecture their prisoners about propaganda. Instead, they simply continue treating them with dignity, allowing the contrast between expectation and reality to speak for itself. The final blow to their indoctrination comes from an unexpected source: Japanese-American soldiers in the US Army. These men, whose families were held in internment camps back home, still chose to serve America with distinction. The nurses struggle to comprehend this complexity. Americans who could be both victim and victor, who could face injustice and still show mercy to former enemies. Truth, they're learning, is far more complicated than propaganda ever suggested. And that complexity is about to reshape not just how they see their former enemies, but how they see themselves. By the fourth week, something extraordinary begins to happen. The invisible walls between captors and prisoners start to crumble, replaced by the simple human desire for connection. It starts with language. Nurse Sato, who studied English before the war, begins helping an American medic understand Japanese medical terms written in captured documents. "Ketsueki," she says slowly, pointing to a character. "Blood." The medic repeats the word carefully, and for the first time in weeks, she smiles. Soon, informal language exchanges become daily routines. American soldiers share English phrases while nurses teach Japanese words and cultural meanings. These aren't military intelligence operations, they're genuine attempts at human communication. When Private Martinez learns to say "arigato gozaimasu," his careful pronunciation brings laughter instead of the tension that had marked earlier interactions. The breakthrough moment comes when Nurse Tanaka discovers that Corporal Bill Crawford carries a photograph of his deceased brother, a medic killed at Normandy. The pain in his eyes as he shows her the picture transcends language barriers. She responds by sharing her own photograph, her younger brother, lost at Okinawa, who had dreamed of becoming a doctor. Two enemies, separated by language and war, sit in silence holding photographs of dead brothers. The moment crystallizes something neither propaganda nor military training had prepared them for. Grief is universal, love transcends borders, and loss speaks a language everyone understands. These small connections multiply. Nurse Yamada teaches an American soldier origami, her nimble fingers creating paper cranes from magazine pages. He responds by carving a small wooden bird with his pocket knife, a clumsy but heartfelt attempt to reciprocate her artistry. Neither gift has military value, but both carry immeasurable human woes. With Dad, food becomes another bridge. The Americans learn that the nurses haven't tasted miso soup in months. Through creative trading with other units, they acquire ingredients for a surprisingly authentic version. It's not perfect, the proportions are wrong, the flavor too mild, but the effort behind it moves the women to tears. In return, the nurses share what little they have. They mend torn uniforms with skills learned from their mothers, creating neat patches where American supplies had left crude repairs. They teach the medics Japanese techniques for preventing infection in tropical wounds, knowledge that will save American lives in the weeks to come. Trust builds in increments. When Nurse Sato falls ill with malaria, she doesn't resist American treatment. When an American soldier develops heat rash, the nurses offer traditional remedies without being asked. Medical knowledge, it turns out, recognizes no national boundaries. The most powerful moment comes during a fierce tropical storm. As rain pounds the camp, Americans and Japanese huddle together in the same tent, sharing warmth and stories. Language barriers fade as human voices blend in universal expressions of fear and comfort. By month's end, something unprecedented has occurred. Former enemies have become, if not friends, then at least fellow human beings who recognize each other's dignity and worth. The day of repatriation arrives with mixed emotions no one expected. October 1945. The nurses stand on the deck of a Red Cross ship, watching the American camp fade into the distance. They should feel relief, joy, anticipation at returning home. Instead, many feel something closer to grief. They're leaving behind people who showed them kindness when they expected cruelty, who treated them with dignity when they anticipated humiliation. Corporal Crawford approaches Nurse Tanaka at the ship's rail. In halting Japanese mixed with English, he says, "Take care, Tanaka-san. You're a good nurse." She responds in similarly broken English, "You too, Crawford-san. Good man." The words are simple, but they carry the weight of a relationship that transcended everything both had been taught about enemies and war. The journey to Japan reveals a homeland transformed beyond recognition. Bombed cities stretch like graveyards of concrete and steel. Hiroshima and Nagasaki exist as names whispered in horror rather than spoke aloud. The empire that had promised eternal victory has collapsed so completely that even its physical landscape seems foreign. But the greatest shock isn't Japan's physical devastation. It's the psychological landscape the nurses encounter. Their countrymen don't want to hear about American kindness. Such stories threaten the narrative many need to maintain their sanity in defeat. How can you process the loss of everything you believed in, while simultaneously learning that your enemies weren't the monsters you were promised? "They gave you food?" asks Tanaka's mother, her voice sharp with disbelief. "They treated you well?" The subtext is clear. If Americans could be kind, what did that say about everything Japan had claimed about them? What did it say about the necessity of all those deaths? The nurses find themselves in an impossible position. Speaking truth fully about their experience feels like betraying their fallen comrades. Remaining silent feels like betraying the Americans who showed them mercy. So most choose a third option. They simply stop talking about it altogether. Nurse Sato returns to work in a Tokyo hospital where resources are scarce and despair is abundant. She finds herself unconsciously applying techniques she learned from American medics, using methods of patient care she observed in that jungle camp. The irony isn't lost on her. She's healing Japanese patients using lessons learned from former enemies. Years pass. The nurses marry, have children, rebuild their lives. But they carry within them a secret knowledge that propaganda lies, that enemies can be kind, that war's greatest casualty is often truth itself. They become living bridges between two narratives of the same conflict, witnesses to complexity in a world that preferred simple stories. 60 years later, in a small apartment in Kyoto, an elderly woman opens a wooden box she's kept hidden for decades. Inside lies a faded photograph. Young Japanese nurses standing beside American soldiers, smiling hesitantly at a camera. It was taken on their last day in captivity, a memento of an experience too complex for public consumption. Nurse Tanaka, now in her 80s, traces the faces with arthritic fingers, remembering names and stories that history books will never record. "My granddaughter asks me about the war," she says to the camera, her voice barely a whisper. "She cannot understand why I don't hate Americans. How do I explain that some of my enemies showed me more kindness than some of my own people?" The question haunts more than individual memory. It challenges our understanding of war itself. In a conflict marked by unprecedented brutality, where propaganda portrayed enemies as subhuman monsters, how do we process moments of genuine mercy? What do they tell us about the human capacity for compassion, even in circumstances designed to destroy it? The nurse's story reveals something profound about the nature of hate and healing. Propaganda works by erasing individual humanity, by reducing complex people to simple caricatures. But when real humans encounter each other, when they share food, exchange stories, recognize mutual grief, the caricatures crumble. Perhaps that's the most important lesson buried in this forgotten chapter of history. In a world still torn by conflict, still fed on narratives of us versus them, the story of these Japanese nurses and their American captors suggests a different possibility. It whispers that mercy can exist alongside justice, that enemies can recognize each other's humanity without betraying their own values. The wooden box closes, but the questions remain open. In our own time of division and conflict, what would happen if we dared to see our enemies as fully human? What bridges might we build if we chose understanding over hate? The echoes of that Pacific mercy still resonate, waiting for someone brave enough to listen.